In the last episode, we discussed the important components of the brain. And the reason why I discussed those important components is to lay the platform for you to understand how trauma will actually affect the human person's attitude and behavior. In this particular segment, I will talk about the trauma as it affects the person and how it rewires the brain. But before I go to that, I would like to basically talk about something that I need to also stress in order for you to understand properly the impact of trauma on the human brain. And that is basically the normal pathways in which the brain processes information as they come from outside. And that is very important. So I'll go through that one first, and then I will talk about trauma as in how it affects the person. So yesterday, last episode, I shared with you the lower brain and then the midbrain as well as the higher brain and their important functions. But as a human person and as a person that is sentient and interacts with the environment and the outside, the organism or the human person receives information from the outside, okay? And it receives those information from the outside through the five senses of the body, if you can remember. And they are the hearing, sight, taste, touch, and the smell, sort of. So the organs that are responsible for those particular senses, we know them as sensory receptors. And it's very important for you to understand that. So the information from the outside comes into the brain through the five senses and through the five receptors of the human person. And so they either come through the eye, the ear, the nose, the taste, or touch. And how do they actually proceed? And that's the part of this first one I want to explain. They will come through the stimulus or the information comes in either color, sight, sound, taste. From that, they come in contact with the five senses. And then from the five senses, they move into the lower brain. The lower brain doesn't do anything with it in the normal sense. It just passes the information up to the midbrain. And the midbrain then passes it up to the higher brain. It is in the higher brain that there is the integration, the analysis, the judgment of what is seen, what is encountered happens. And so the higher brain moderates the information comes in, and then it gives back the input back to the parts of the body that's responsible for particular responses, like actions, like talking, like moving, like dancing, for example. These are the responses that happen when you interact with the outside and how you respond to them. So the flow of the direction of the information goes simply like this. The information, which sometimes you call the stimulus or the trigger, reaches the five senses, either the eye, the nose, or the taste, and then goes straight to the lower brain, pass through the midbrain, up to the higher brain. And then from the higher brain, the integration occurs, the thinking, the analysis happens, and then it gives you the actions, gives you the execution, the command to do this or that, depending on the information that you receive. That all said, that is the actually normal pathway and how the brain processes information from the outside in. Now, I want to mention that so as to lay the foundation for which we will go on to the next component, which is trauma and how trauma affects. And so, trauma is a basic term, a term that many people have heard of, known, but it's synonymous with the word injury, and it's like a harmful, life-threatening, prolonged or short, intense injury that affects the dignity of the person or the integrity of the person. And that means it can affect the mind, The trauma can affect the body or even can affect the emotional as well as the spiritual well-being of the person. And the information comes from the outside. It's usually a incident of some sort that actually impacted the integrity of the person on these three levels: the spiritual, psychological, and mental, or even the physical aspects of the person. And so we talk about certain life-threatening stimulus or impact on the life of the person. Now, when that life-threatening or intense or painful, unpleasant experience occurs, the person receives the information. And the moment it perceives it to be a life-threatening thing, what the person enters into is to switch on to what we call a survival mode response. The survival mode, as you know, belongs to the lower brain. And the life-threatening information happens, the person switches to what we call a fight or flight response, in which the person does not have to think about anything. He just moves in quick and fast way to actually avoid the intensity of the pain. And that's what happened in any traumatic event, because the energy is so strong, so negative, so painful, and life-threatening. And so the brain reacts in such a way that it moves by its automatic function to avoid the pain. And so what happens then is the energy the intense negative energy is stored only in these two places: the lower brain as well as the midbrain. The midbrain records the pain and keeps it. The lower brain keeps the action that is need to be done to escape from that pain, and so the person is not aware of what's happening. And that's the reason why you have symptoms like shock. That's the reason why you have speechlessness when a sudden, hard, life-threatening event occurs and it threatens your life. You just run into shock mode where you don't talk, you froze, you couldn't even think clear as well. Because in this process, the higher brain is not involved. It's only the lower and the midbrain that are involved. Therefore, the person is not aware of what intensity is locked in the lower and the midbrain. And so, in that particular situation, when the event actually happens, the person can avoid it of some sort or capitulate to it or been affected by it. And it affects the person in a great way, but the energy is not understood properly because it doesn't reach the higher brain actually to integrate them. So it's locked in the lower and the midbrain of the human person. Because of that energy results by creating a lot of funny states, actually. It creates the person to present with a lot of symptoms, and I'll give you some symptoms. Before I talk about the symptoms, we will just go through some of the things that can cause trauma in which we find ourselves in our daily life. For example, physical abuse can come and can happen most especially in children or just in a person maybe punching someone or fighting. Physical abuse can come in fracture, trauma, accident, for example. Then you also have traumatic experience through sexual abuse when somebody is being violated sexually. And it happens more in the woman population, the young girls, and the small children. Then you have also the psychological abuse or neglect when a person is being neglected, wasn't given its proper due in terms of, especially affects more children in that regard when the parents are not taking well care of their children. It also comes in sex trafficking or in natural disasters like cyclones, tsunami. It affects also, can occur in issues like terrorism, violence, community violence, school violence, or even like cases where bullying, when a person bullies another person, it gives them that also traumatic experience, or domestic violence between couples, between parents and children, between siblings. You can have those experiences during war, refugee, or even serious accidents or life-threatening illnesses like cancer, stuff like that. Or in a way, it can also happen in systemic neglect, when person are being neglected for some reason or been oppressed, like in case of slavery and so on. So those are some of the causes that can cause traumatic experience to people. And we experience those things as small as when we are in the womb, in our mother's womb, and as old as in old age, depending on what sort of traumatic impact or injury you have. But otherwise, trauma can actually affect anywhere along your life cycle, and it can cause a lot of disruption to your behavior if it's not well understood. Now, those are some of the causes that can cause life-threatening danger to a person. I will just discuss with you how they present when, after the trauma has passed, the person moved on in life, but how they can appear again. And once they are triggered, they reappear, or they can actually affect the person in its behavior, if you can say so. Let me give you some examples. A student who has trauma can actually have what we call intrusive memories. So when they sit down in class, suddenly there's a memory just pop in and then disturbs them in class. So they lose their concentration, they have loss of concentration, and sometimes they lost of interest in their schoolwork. They are not able to sit quiet in class. They kind of move around, irritable. Some they can present as becoming depression. In other words, they isolate themselves, withdraw themselves to their own, and they don't want to encounter any other person. Some they can feel the numbing experience on their body. It's becoming psychosomatic, in which they feel numbness from their legs to their toes, to their head or something. Some they can have what we call insomnia. In other words, they cannot sleep well, or even though they sleep well, they have nightmares because they dream about that particular traumatic event presenting itself like images of demons or something chasing them. Some they have startled responses, and when they respond, it's like they are shocked when they are responding to you. They are not, and it creates them to, uh, yeah, respond in a startled sort of way. The other ones, they have this shame or self-hatred, and they have panic attacks. Some people, they have chronic headaches. Some have eating disorders, and others, they abuse substances like alcohol, marijuana. Those are like creates a numbing effect on their stress related problem, because the trauma is locked in the stress center as well as the lower brain. It affects their behavior. It makes them to have a self-destructive behavior in which they don't behave normally as you would like to expect them. They have a lot of memory issues. They remember very little. Even though you teach them a lot of things, they couldn't remember. And they are hypervigilant. They are just scanning every place and everybody for whatever problem that may happen. And that creates danger to them. So those are some of the symptoms that I'd like to point out. And there are many others. If it was in the children will always sit in what we call a fetal position, like a defensive mode in class. And so it's nice that teachers should learn to recognize them as well. Now, in summary, trauma rewires the brain. If you can remember what I said, the stimulus comes in, goes to the sensory receptors, to the lower brain, midbrain, and then to the higher brain, and then it creates the response. But when trauma comes, the information is passed from the receptors to the low and the mid, and then it bypasses the higher brain and it go into action. And that's the reason why those who are traumatized, they have what we call hyper-emotional states. Their emotion can really go way off the chart to the point that it creates a hyper-irrational reactions. they just act irrationally, and they already do something they don't even want to think about because they are reacting in a traumatic mode. And so it affects, it affects the behavior. It affects the relationship with others, because as long as the trigger comes in, it switches off the person's brain into a survival mode, and then the person reacts in a normal situation in a traumatic way, and then it affects people around them, and it affects the education, it affects the moral behavior, their decision making, and even their emotional well-being as well is affected. And that is what trauma does. And it's important that seminarians, people who are dealing with students in for that regard, need to aware and know this, so that they can help them able to transcend those pains and allow them to actually heal themselves before they can grow more humanly possible in the society. So that is basically the effects of trauma on the brain. And on the next episode, we'll discuss how to deal with it. Thank you, Tomas.